I'd like to respond to an interview that Alex O'Connor had with atheist and New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman. In a previous video, I looked at one of Ehrman's claims, which was blatantly not true, and you'll see the link in the description below. But in this response video, I'd like to pick up where I left off and look at another one of Ehrman's claims.
People might be surprised to hear you make this claim that in all of the Synoptic Gospels, we don't get Jesus claiming to be God.
Yeah.
And that was the claim that I responded to in the previous video. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested. So let's now look at his next claim.
Because, of course, people will want to say that, okay, maybe Jesus wasn't walking around saying that he was God.
Yeah.
But maybe doing so wouldn't have been a particularly great strategy.
Yeah.
Maybe in order to have enough time to have his message understood by his early followers and to sort of conduct his ministry before eventually being killed, if he just immediately started claiming to be God, he'd just be killed straight away. And so what he needs to do is get the message across, get the important moral teachings, which are the sort of most important part of his ministry, and then allow future generations after he died to realize the truth.
Yeah, no, that would be a plausible way to argue. I'm not convinced by it. It'd be a mistake to say he was covering it up so that they wouldn't kill him any earlier, because he's actually not crucified for calling himself God. His divine claims have no relationship to any of the crucifixion narratives. And so it's not that that's going to get him in trouble.
So, I mean, what is it? What is the...
Alex seems a little taken aback by Ehrman's statement just now. And I am too. I'm baffled why Ehrman just said that. And I want to quote Ehrman. What he says is, quote, his divine claims have no relationship to any of the crucifixion narratives. This is an example of something that baffles me. And I want to come back to why he might say things like this at the end of this video. But let's actually take a look at just a few short quotes from the crucifixion narratives to see if his divine claims have any relationship whatsoever to getting crucified. And in the Gospel of Mark, we have Jesus standing before the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, the night before he's crucified, and they're examining him. And I quote, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving of death. Now, despite what Ehrman claimed that Jesus never made a claim to deity in the Synoptic Gospels, what you've just heard is Jesus' most audacious and blatant and significant claim to be God in the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark. And which Ehrman says Jesus never said anything like that. And it's most audacious because he made it in the presence of the religious leaders. And their conclusion is that he needs to die. And so they deliver him to Pilate. So that's their motive. In the Gospel of Luke, quote, "And they all said, 'So you are the Son of God.' And he said to them, 'You say correctly that I am.' And then they said, 'What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth.' Then the entire assembly of them set out and brought him before Pilate." So what we observe here is that the primary motive that the religious leaders had to deliver him to Pilate to get crucified was not because he was making claims to be king of the Jews. No, that was not even part of this discussion here. What their motive was is that he has claimed to be God. He has committed gross blasphemy. He needs to die, and so they deliver him to Pilate to get crucified because they don't have the legal authority to execute anybody. So that's, go back to Ehrman's claim there. He stated, his divine claims have no relationship to any of the crucifixion narratives, and we can see that that's just patently false. And why does he say these things? And I'll come back to that at the end of my comments here, but let's move on to see what he says next.
Oh, it's pretty clear. When you read the trial narratives, Pontius Pilate kills him for claiming to be the king of the Jews.
So there's Ehrman's next claim as to why Jesus was crucified. he says that Pilate killed him because he was claiming to be king of the Jews. And once again, let's just read the narratives, the records of what happened when Jesus was on trial before Pilate. I'll just give you a few quotes here. First of all is Mark's gospel account. Quote, "And Pilate asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And he answered him, 'You have said so.' And the chief priests accused him of many things. And he answered them, saying, 'Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?' For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. And Pilate again said to them, 'Then what shall I do with the man you call King of the Jews?' And they cried out again, 'Crucify him.' And Pilate said to them, 'Why? What evil has he done?' But they shouted all the more, 'Crucify him.' So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified." So let's just pause here. He saw right through this. There was envy a problem here. And as far as Pilate was concerned, this man is innocent. There's no need to crucify him. There's nothing, no guilt in this guy. But his motive for delivering him over to get crucified was to satisfy the crowd. And I quote again, satisfy the crowd. Let me read a very short quote from Matthew's Gospel. Quote, "Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning. He took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, 'I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves.' And all the people answered, 'His blood be on us and on our children.'" And so what we see here is that Pilate's motive for delivering Jesus to be crucified was simply to maintain the peace. And that was very important as procurator. He could get into big trouble if a riot broke out in Jerusalem. And officially, they brought him before Pilate for the official reason he's claiming to be king, and of course that's a problem if you're in the Roman Empire. And then later on in the Gospel of John, which Ehrman rejects, but I don't, Gospel of John, there's quite a dialogue between Jesus and Pilate. But the people threatened Pilate to say, "We'll tell Caesar that this man says he's the king and you did nothing." And so Pilate, seeing he's in a very bad situation, delivers him over to be crucified. But his primary motive is, he's got a very ugly situation in his hands. His own career is at stake. There's a riot about to break out. Jesus is being king of the Jews, as far as he's concerned, that's not his concern. He sees there's no issue there. But his primary motive is to maintain the peace, pacify the religious rulers, so he delivers him to be crucified. So why does Ehrman make such blatantly false claims that we've just witnessed here? And I've thought about this for quite a few weeks, and I've come up with three options. Option number one is that he's badly uninformed of what the New Testament narratives actually state. And I just have to reject that. He's a New Testament scholar. He's published papers on a lot of areas related to the New Testament. I cannot believe that he's just simply badly informed. So I reject that option number one. Option number two is not so nice. It's less charitable, but he is deliberately misrepresenting the data, which is the New Testament documents. He's deliberately misrepresenting that, and just to mislead the general population. It's a dishonest thing to do. And I find myself wanting to reject that option as well for two reasons. Number one, it's very uncharitable to accuse someone to be deliberately doing this. And number two, it would just be crazy to do that because a 12-year-old could call him on this. Any 12-year-old who actually read those documents. That's the data. They could call him on this. So I have to reject the idea, at least to be charitable, that he's deliberately and intentionally misleading the general population. Option number three is a little more complicated. It might be, and it's more acceptable in the academic world, both in philosophy and in religious studies, is that you come up with a premise. You embrace a premise, something that you have thought of or put together in your own mind. We'll call it premise X. And from that premise, you create an argument that leads to a conclusion. And what we're listening to here are Ehrman's conclusions based on a premise X, that he has personally embraced. But in logic, what you need to do at that point is to test your conclusions to see if it contradicts the data, which it obviously does. If the conclusions contradict the data, then your premise X has been falsified. To clarify, if your conclusions that have arisen out of premise X contradict the data, then premise X is false. And that's actually a logical move in philosophy, where you come up with a premise, you see if it leads to a contradiction, and if it does, then you know the premise is false. And so what we can conclude here is whatever premises that Ehrman has embraced, and we won't go into those here, that would be much more in-depth and complicated. Let's just call them premises X or premise X. That premise X is leading Ehrman to certain conclusions that clearly contradict the data. And therefore we can conclude that his foundational premises from which he is reasoning, these premises X, which he has put together or embraced, are actually false. But Ehrman has not taken that final step. He has continued to embrace them and therefore continue to promote conclusions that directly contradict the very data that he looks at and that we all are working from.